Let's come to Symbols 6, which means that we're mid-phase on the fourth phase of an integral cycle. And this integral cycle is the way things are. It's the way the universe happens and registers and is experienceable, and that registers and creates an interior space of thought, a space of the mind, and that mental space, that interior space where thought takes place, has a cognate flow with the space of the way in which ritual existence has its dimensions, its three dimensions of form and context both. It's important to understand that there are many kinds of spaces. By the early 21st century in mathematics, we have dozens of ways to organize space. String theory says there are at least three major echelons of space in reality, and that physical space is only one of them. What's important is that in the natural cycle, all of it is integral. All of it tends to want to come together into form. And so when we get to an interior space of thought, the number one issue is how in that space does structure come into form. And the earliest sophisticated written record of how that exactly happens is in Plato. It's difficult because we do not, in our normal education, understand how recent the written specificity of understanding on this level, both the scope of it, the range, the depth, how recent that was. All over the world, when we look at any civilization or any culture, any development, you do not find a sophisticated written record until about 2,400 years ago. It's true that writing surfaced in places like Sumer, in places like the Indus Valley civilization, in places like early Egypt, that a written hieroglyph or a written pictoglyph, glyph or graph, that early Sumerian writing goes back to 3,000, sometimes 3,300 BC. But they were not for discourse. They were sacred, written, pictorial gestalts that were meant only for a very rare set of people under rare circumstances. In Egypt, the earliest hieroglyphics are the pyramid texts, dating not from the original pyramids, but dating the first of the pyramid texts was the Pyramid of Unas, about 2500 BC. And when you look at the hieroglyphs that make their appearance as the earliest pyramid texts at the Pyramid of Unas, it is an architectural calibration that gives it its syntactic and grammatical structure. The page of the language is not a page of a book. It's not written on a scroll. It is written on the interior space of the building. So that when you would enter the Pyramid of Unas, at the entrance, the hieroglyphic sacred text would begin there and would run itself along the interior walls, the corridors, the rooms of the pyramid itself, and come to its culmination in the sarcophagus room, deep in the pyramid. So at that stage, at 2500 BC, written symbolic language was only put on the interior level of the architecture of a mind, the pyramid at that stage being the interiorization of life, so that that particular written language expression would be in a supra-individual mental space. We would call that today a space of transform. That when the mind has its space covered by symbolic writing capable of absorbing a transform, the transform will come in like an extra dimension and will vivify that language, so that that language then projects off the walls into the space and revivifies whoever is in there. Let's go back over it for just a moment, because this is extremely powerful and important. A written language is not meant to be just read on a page, on a scroll, on walls. But originally it was put on walls, it was put on scrolls, it was put on surfaces so that it would project in extra dimensions off those surfaces into a spherical space that was an interior space, like the interior space of the mind, and revivify it, bring it back into living, back into life. So that the word in a written symbolic language originally was a conveyor, like a transistor, to bring extra energy from extra dimensions back into play, so that life would not just continue, but would revivify and come back refreshed, come back again. So that the function of a written symbolic language was to ensure a resurrection, a coming back into play, so that the cycle of life would come back into play, would recommence, and one would have life again. This is very difficult for us after many millennia of distortion, after centuries of ignorance and contention, to appreciate just how profound this was. In the Egyptian heritage, the preservation of the focus of symbolic written language was finally put into not just the surrounding structure of the interior of the architecture of the pyramids, but was focused increasingly on the sarcophagus. So that one not only had pyramid texts at the beginning, but later on there was another phase where one had what they call coffin texts. The texts that would be on the outside of the sarcophagus and on the inside of the sarcophagus. And the lid of the sarcophagus held the cinching symbol, and the cinching symbol was always a female goddess, and her name was Nut. And her spread nude body, the toes of which were on one horizon, the fingers of the hands on the other horizon, she was the arch of rebirth. She gave you life again. So that you were born of a mother on earth originally, but your rebirth was from a celestial mother who spanned the entire universe. And one was able to enter into her metaphorical womb by the fact that all of this written symbolic language, in its projectiveness, in its vivifying life space, was able to course through you to such an extent that you were ready to be a new seed and be given rebirth. But in order to have rebirth, it wasn't a matter, as is so prevalent in our rather ignorant age, that you just make an acceptance of some savior. Oh yeah, they'll do it for me. No. You had to prepare yourself to be a new seed by making sure that the focus of that written symbolic language came together as a seed form at the core of your being, at the core of your mind, at the focus of your mind, at the center of who it was that you were as an individual. But that individual, in the natural ecology and cycle, had died, was susceptible to the limitations of a course of life, of a cycle of life. Things are born, they live, they go through their cycle, and they die. It's the natural cycle. So in order to come back into life, to be reborn, to have a rebirth, one then had to have a new cycle that began and started. And one of the things that interfered with it was the ignorant mind that just mechanically focused in some kind of flat way a diagram of the language's significance. That it wasn't really a live seed, but it was just an image of the seed. It was just an appearance of the seed. And so it was extremely important to be able to not just tell the difference and know the difference, but to come into contact with those who could practice the difference between just an image of something and the actuality of it. And the image was the image then of an integral center to one's individuality. But one's individuality is a completely integral, related thing. What revivifies the whole cycle of life is a spirit person who is not limited by the natural cycle of life and death. An extra dimension or so that could be brought back into play, and the way in which ancient people would talk about this, especially in Egypt, the way was that this is a quintessence, this is a quintessential aspect that revivifies life. It isn't limited just to the 4 dimensions of time and space, but is a 5th dimension of a spiritual consciousness. It comes back into play and re-triggers the whole cycle of life again so that one comes back into life. Not that one continues the old life, but one comes back into life and has a whole other life. And that this whole other life has a continuity with the previous life in a very special way. That this quintessential spiritual wisdom restores you not to a circle of yet another life that you will just live, be born, live for a while, and then die again. That would be putting you back on a circular track. Someone lifts the circumstance up, puts the needle back on the record that just plays over and over again on that circle. that is an integral ignorance, because reality is not on a circular basis, but that reality is in fact on a grand spiral. And that the spiral is so huge that it seems to the unpracticed eye that these must be concentric circles that go out, and yet if one can know, if one can be really deeply insightful, one can see that all of these constitute not concentric circles, but the different ridges in a very grand but very refined, tight spiral. Now we have seen, just in the last month or so, when Cassini went to Saturn, and the people who prepared it for a whole generation. And when they got to Saturn, the first thing that Cassini was able to do was to take detailed CCDs, photographs of the rings of Saturn, and send back information. And one could see graphically, and one of the second largest planet in the star system, that the rings of Saturn are not rings of circles, but that the rings, all of them, are different spins on spirals that come out and generate density waves that have particular properties that only spiraling has. Tight spirals, yes, but they are not isolated circles, but that every wind of a spiral is related to the ongoing dynamic concourse of the whole. This is the way which in reality form takes place out of process. The energy forms stabilize within a real dynamic that has a spiral, a continuity to it. Forms are not statically circles by themselves, isolated, but they participate in arcs of a grand spiral that is always there and always ongoing. And so the restoration comes in a rebirth to the grand spiraling and not being put back on another circle that will come to an end. This was a very difficult thing 5,000 years ago to express to anyone, even to oneself. And the earliest pyramid texts in Egypt, the earliest writings in Iran are the Gathas of Zarathustra. The earliest writings in India are in a glyphic language that has never been deciphered, still is not deciphered. And the earliest really discursive writings in Sumeria are the beginnings of a literate language that came to a flame of expression about 2350 BC in the reign of Sargon of Akkad. And the pattern was that every so often, every 500-600 years, every 1,000 years, there would be another era of genius where the written language, the symbolic mind, would take yet another step, another spin of the spiral, where it was differentially a little bit farther out, a little bit more refined, and written language achieved more facility. Written symbols began to be more shareable among people. So that when one looks at 2500 to say 2300 BC, you get the first great era where written symbols begin to have what we would call depth and meaning. Sufficient meaning to really begin to create things like the Inanna epics, the Gilgamesh epics, the pyramid texts of Egypt, the undeciphered texts of India and the Indus Valley, the earliest Gathas of Zarathustra. The next time that there was an era of genius about symbolic forms, about symbolic writings, came about 1100 BC. Came about 1400 years later, 12, 13, 1400 years later, and around 1100 BC, 1000 BC, you began to get a tighter quality of the symbol, a wider loop of the spiral, of the ability to give symbolic writing forms additional meaning. And in that era, you get the epics of Homer in Greece. You get the writings of Moses in the Hebrew tradition. You get the I Ching in China. You get the beginning of the Vedas in India, where before the Vedic practices were largely ritual-based that were carried by sets, layers of priests who would carry out the rituals. In India, all of a sudden you begin to find, like the Rig Veda, you find things written down. And a whole new level of the officiating priest take place. You have people who are at the Agni sacrifice, for instance, who not only perform it, but there are Hoter priests who chant it in such a way that it is checked against the written record. Someone who is able to read it, reads it so that they see, does the written Rig Veda on the page project into the interior space of the mind a reality objectively that jibes with the actual ritual functions that are happening out here in the world? And conversely, are the ritual actions that we are doing in the Agni sacrifice for all these many days, does that amount to resonances that bunch together and add up and jibe with what we understand in our mind? And so there was that kind of a correlation. And so you find in the written symbolic languages of that era, about 3,000 years ago, you find a great concern to make sure that how we understand in our minds fits together with what we do out in the world. The I Ching is like that. The books of Moses are like that. The Vedas are like that all over the world. A deep sea change happened about 700 years later in the 300s BC. And it's in the 300 BC area, say 300 to about 380 BC. In that period, the 300s BC, for the first time you find another loop of the spiral, a wider range, a deeper understanding, and you find that the written symbolic literature of that era is much expanded from before. It's not just an increment the same as the I Ching and Moses and the Rig Veda is over the previous pyramid texts, over the previous Gathas of Zarathustra. One finds that the jump in capacity is not just one more step forward, but has a geometricity in its quality. It's exponential of what it was before. And so you find at that period of time all over the world, you find written symbolic texts that now are formidable enough that when we read them 2,400 years later, we still are astounded at the deep quality of understanding, the refinement of men and women to be able to really not only craft this in this way, but to have the art to be able to convey it in such a way that even today we feel the impress. And so you find all over the world at that period, in the 300s BC, For the first time in India, instead of the Rig Veda or the Atharva Veda being written down, what you find is the Bhagavad Gita. You find Valmiki's epic of the Ramayana. You find Vyasa's epic of the Mahabharata. There is no written Sanskrit documents before the 300s BC that are comparable to that, and then all of a sudden everywhere on the subcontinent you find this genius. In China, the difference between the I Ching of 1100 BC and the kind of writing that you find in the 300s BC, what do you find there? You find for the first time the gorgeous period of Chinese philosophy, as they say. You find Mencius and Chuang-Tzu. Mencius is the first written Confucian documents that are not in the form of Confucius said, which is somebody remembering what the oral tradition was. Oh, well, Confucius said so-and-so. You read Mencius, and you have a philosophic presentation in Mencius for the first time. You have a Confucianism that counts on not repeating in a rote way what was said, so that it's just the record of an oral teaching, but is itself a written teaching, meant so that the mind gets its projection off the written symbols of the book, the scroll. One reads Mencius not to hear what the master said, but what Mencius is saying to you, reading it. So that the reader now has a cooperative, creative element in symbolic language that has just now been refined to that point. All of Plato's dialogues belong to the 300s BC. It's of that age, like Mencius and Chuang-Tzu. It's of that quality where the Bhagavad Gita and the Ramayana come into play. And at that point, there was a great crisis everywhere in the world, because for the very first time, there was a responsibility on the part of those who would keep wisdom alive, who would teach wisdom, who would teach the wisdom of that we have a spiritual quintessence that can come back into play, so that we are not something that lives and then dies. We are not throwawayable on some circle which is isolated from everything else, and only by clinging to that circle are we going to stay alive, and then that's it. So there was a great watershed at that period, and all of the wisdom literature of that period is all concerned with establishing the maintenance of the ancient wisdom, that this all is in a living spiral, and that you can be deceived by appearances. That appearances can deceive, and that those appearances are not ugly, but they're worldly attractive. They deceive because one, without really knowing, are attracted to them because they seem that this is really fun. This is really important. This is famous. This is successful. The most conspicuous thing for us, and this is why we're using Plato, using Plato's Phaedrus, it is archetypally the most clear place in the world where this important realization on the place of symbols in the mind, in its relationship to life, is clearly delineated. It's one of the greatest documents in the world. And like all documents coming from classical Greece at the time, it has ostensibly this report of a dialogue. Even the Bhagavad Gita is the report of a dialogue between Arjuna and Krishna. But Vyasa is wise. He doesn't just give us a dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. That dialogue is heard in the yogic mind of the sage who is up on the ridge, and the blind king Dhritarashtra cannot see, and so he depends on the sage to use his yogic hearing and his yogic seeing to say to the king in such a language that it records on the inner mind of the blind king. Even though he can't see externals in the world, he can see within his mind with this extra vivified, quintessential conscious dimension that comes into play. He's only blind in terms of the 4 dimensions of time-space. But he is not blind when you bring a 5th dimension of spiritual consciousness into play. Now his mind can see clearly. And so Plato's Phaedrus has this kind of quality, and there are a lot of parallels between Plato and the wisdom of India. You have to understand that India is a part of the West. Everything from Ireland to India has the same cultural, spiritual integral and a very similar differential transform. Whereas the Chinese are different. The American Indians are different. The American Indians are like the Chinese. They're very cognate together. Once one understands Chinese wisdom, you can go to a place like Central Asia reaches of Iran or to the Americas, and one can understand that this is a different way of not only integrating, but of transforming. You find in Plato a lot of parallels to the Indian written things. For instance, we're going to talk about next week in the Phaedrus, the charioteer, the metaphor, the myth of the charioteer. And one finds that in the Upanishads as well, exactly like you find it in Plato. There are many parallels. What's important for us in the Phaedrus is that Socrates does not write anything down. He is still in the tradition of an oral lineage that he has received. And his oral lineage that he has received, the person who brought it to him was a woman named Diotima. But it's alluded to in the Phaedrus. There's a paragraph on it. But the place where one finds a larger explication of just how this was and how this works is in the dialogue that comes before the Phaedrus called the Symposium. And for this, one has to begin to understand when one looks at Greek tragedy, there never were single plays. They were always written in trilogies with a 4th little play called a satyr play that went with it. It's like going to films when they were first coming out in the 30s and 40s, and you would see a feature and there would be a cartoon. Only in the early way in which symbolic writing began to find its way on the page, it wasn't just a play, but it was a bunched resonance of trilogies that were together with a little bit of a 4th, like a cartoon, to give you the sense that this was, it had elan. It wasn't just a serious structure alone, but that the seriousness of the structure was not meant to be serious, but to give you life again, to revivify. And so Plato's dialogues need to be read in groups, largely in groups of 3 that go together. It's like later on in Elizabethan England, Shakespeare's plays are meant to be read in tetralogies, in fours. And if one reads them in such a way that one gets the entire group, then what happens is you get all of the dimensions that are needed to allow for the projection of meaning to be vivifying. And that if you only take one thing is like a text, one thing is like a document, there's no way to effectively allow it to give its projection into spherical geometric space, and there's no way for the mind then to realize that its mental space has a sphericality to it and is not just a graphable, documentary surface. Because as long as it thinks that it is an analog of the page, of the graph, of the sign record, of the ritual actions just in step by step, the mind accepts that its rote recall is a function of memory. Whereas the function of memory is not for a rote recall, but for a remembering of the entire sphericality of the spiraling continuity of all the gestalts and how they work together. So it's the difference between an alive mind and a dead mind. And a dead mind, because it is dead, does not in its own right live, but waits for someone else on the outside to maneuver it in such a way that then it will have the appearance of life. And that this is the very core of the way in which tyrannies happen. Egos wait for somebody who is really dominant to tell them what to do. Societies that are flatted out and dead wait for great leaders to tell them what to do. And so on and so forth on every level. And so it is the vivification of the integral symbolic mind so that it can have its own individuality revived by a spiritual vision, by a conscious transform that comes to it out of its own resource. Why out of its own resource? Because the spirit does not die. The spirit is a dimension of the spiral of reality. How is it going to die? Where is it going to go that it isn't? And so some of the qualities that are there in Plato's Phaedrus are teased out in the 20th century by Suzanne K. Langer, among almost all of the philosophers of the time. She got it in a way that Plato got it from Socrates, who got it from Diotima, who was able to manifest it because of her association with Pythagoras, who learned it in Egypt at Heliopolis in Iran. He was there for about 11 years as well. And so in the great classical Greek tradition, one has to envision it this way. You had a person like Pythagoras who was able to imbibe, tune himself like a musical instrument, and come back after 30-some years and play out a living tradition that was largely oral. And the first generation of people who got it in that kind of a mode. Whereas Diotima, one of the top Pythagorean teachers, practitioners, when she taught Socrates, she taught him in such a way that he would be able to, in his presentation of the oral quality of wisdom teaching, be able to have students who would be able to get a deeper quality in their own minds and be able to transform written language in that way. And Plato was his great student. His other great student was the great historian Xenophon, whose book, The Memoirs of Socrates, is the best testimony that we have to his actual life. We're going to come back after a break. Let me just position this one more time. The mind that is alive does not die. The life that has that dimension of life is a free life. The last chapter that Suzanne Langer was writing near 90 is called Open Ambient. Let's take a break. Let's come back, and we're trying to appreciate why the era of Plato is so important. And as we've expressed, the 300s BC is the era of the first writing down of great discursive wisdom. It's the first time that you have in India things like the Bhagavad Gita, the Ramayana, things in China like Mencius and Chuang-Tzu, in Greece, Plato, and the whole development of the emphasis that historical understanding is both perilous and advantageous at the very same time. The next great cycle in the world where written symbolic language that had come into play at least 2500 BC with, as we said, the Rig Veda, with the pyramid texts in Egypt, with the Gathas of Zarathustra, with the Inanna and Gilgamesh epics in Sumeria. And then 1,000 years later with the I Ching and the prophetic books of Moses and the development of Homer. And then the 300s BC, the next great push was at the end of the 1st century AD. And in that era, you have things like the New Testament, the Hermetic treatises, the development of the Mahayana in the Prajnaparamita texts, the great development of a lot of Taoist material in China, so that the world goes through cycles which are not circles, but they are particular loops of this great spiral. And in our time, the early 21st century is one of the greatest of all the arcs, the turn of this great spiral. And it's very difficult now because a lot of what is being presented here is presentational and not representational. And a mind that is miseducated will not be able to understand presentation. One of the great chapters in Suzanne K. Langer's Philosophy in a New Key, chapter 4, is called Discursive and Presentational Forms. And it's all about the difficulties posed by a philosopher, not posed by a philosopher, but given an illustration to the nth degree, and the philosopher was Wittgenstein. And his book, the great Tractatus Logico Philosophicus, the treatise on philosophic logic that came out in the 1920s. One of its most important translators was a man, C.K. Ogden, in England. Wittgenstein wrote in German. And Ogden was an enormously interesting character, and he teamed up with one of the greatest structural literary critics of all time, I.A. Richards. And Ogden and Richards put out a series of books published in England, and it reads like a who's who. Jung's psychological types, Bertrand Russell's, a lot of his major works. It was called the International Library of Psychology, Philosophy, and Scientific Method. And it was an attempt to put out a series of books that were all resonant with each other about the crisis of the mind that was there from the early 20th century up until about the 1940s. The crisis of the symbolic mind in the early 20th century was a twofold process. One was the fading away, the dematerialization of the confidence in the natural world. And at the same time, the rise of the realization that there were many mysterious, even occult, perhaps even mystical dimensions to reality. And of course, the all-time great fulcrum in this was 1895 with the accidental discovery of X-rays, when Röntgen in Germany misplaced some blank photographic paper in the same drawer with a sample of radium, and the photographic paper showed the clouded quality of some invisible rays and the dark impress of something in the drawer on the photographic paper. It was incomprehensible to the science of the day. How could this happen? There was no way in which physical reality took stock in something that was obviously an energy that was in the electromagnetic spectrum but was never recorded, completely unknown. And with the discovery of X-rays, it was possible for the first time to realize that the energy of reality is on scales that were unimaginable before then. So that the scale of human life was suddenly not just having its boundaries dissolved, but dematerialized to the point to where people were completely adrift. And of course, there are three ways to regard that. One is to freeze and to remain where you are traditionally, stick to fundamental values, and don't venture outside the lines. The other is to flight, to run from it, to try and get out of it somehow. And the third is to fight, to combat it. One of the books in the International Library of Psychology, Philosophy, and Scientific Method is called The Meaning of Meaning, a study of the influence of language upon thought and of the science of symbolism, Ogden and Richards. Now, Ogden was also the translator of Wittgenstein's great philosophic work, which was the epitome of the logic that was traditional from Aristotle all the way up until that day, up until 1920. Ogden's translation revealed to Wittgenstein aspects of his own work that he had not realized, and so there is a collection of letters of Wittgenstein to Ogden. And in it, one of the most revealing sections of Wittgenstein in this seminal book, he wanted to make sure that every statement was completely logical in its sequence, so they are all numbered. And it begins with a classic statement, number 1, the world is everything that is the case. Then 1.1, the world is the totality of facts, not of things. 1.11, the world is determined by the facts, and by these being all the facts. 1.12, For the totality of facts determines both what is the case and also that it is not the case. 1.13, the facts in logical space are the world. So one has the boiling down, the reduction of the entire Western logical tradition from Aristotle to Wittgenstein down to this precise, almost engineering presentation. And in the presentation, when one comes to the fours, one finds for the first time the gist of what Wittgenstein is struggling with, that his logical accuracy was beginning to reveal to himself, surprising him. Actually, later on, it became a shock to him. He's writing about how symbolic forms that are written, and they are written down, have several senses in which they are read. One is in which they are read mentally, in a mental space, which a subset of that mental space is the logical space, and yet at the same time, how they are read so that they are doable in the world. And he uses as an example, because he was a literate man from Vienna, and so in Vienna, one of the great arts is music. Beethoven, Mozart, Viennese music is the prize of the 19th century. And Vienna, of course, is the place that one would expect that one would understand music, and Wittgenstein did. He says, colloquial language is a part of the human organism and is not less complicated than it. From it is humanly impossible to gather immediately the logic of language. In other words, the colloquial language that is spoken as an oral spoken language in the world of that time does not at all show its logical structure, which is underneath that. Now notice here, the logical structure is to the worldly mind an invisible structure that has to be discerned by like an X-ray vision of symbolic understanding to go beneath the surface. That there is a skeleton beneath that flesh, and it is the skeleton that determines the structure and not the flesh, not the appearance, not the pictures. So he says, language disguises the thought. Now notice here, oral language, as we're understanding it here, is a process of experience, whereas a written symbolic language is the structure of the meaning of the language in the mind. So one is now going to have to X-ray experience in the world and get down to the structure of the mental, logical form in its logical space in the mind. This is a very severe problem. We'll get back to Plato in just a moment, but it's interesting. Language disguises the thought, so that from the external form of the clothes one cannot infer the form of the thought they clothe, because the external form of the clothes is constructed with quite another object than to let the form of the body be recognized. So it's a logical structure is like the real mind individual, Whereas the colloquial language that is spoken is a deceptive clothing that is there for worldly purposes, to convey stature if you're well-dressed, to disclose that you're impoverished if you're poorly dressed. In other words, you get it. Ancient wisdom was always that oral language was primary. By the early 20th century, oral language is not only not primary, it was deceptive. Without the ability to go in an X-ray to the symbolic structure of thought, one would not know the truth by the way people talked in the world. And what this does is it removes the trusting of experience as the basis for symbolic understanding, and puts the basis of symbolic understanding into an abstraction that rejects experience as being deceptive. It is a very classic failure. It's a very classic failure. The very first time that one finds somebody talking about this problem is in the Gathas of Zarathustra about 4,000 years ago. He says in the original Gathas that there are many so-called wise people. He calls them, at the time they were called kavis. They pretend to be the wise people, and they control all the ritual functions that are around in society. They're the authorities that have commandeered religion and commandeered the control of society. And their whole position is that they need to be obeyed because deception, the deceiver in the world, is of equal power to the truth of the world. So that good and evil are like equal, and you need the authority of knowing priesthood, of a special group of people in society to protect us from evil, to ensure that good is protected. And Zarathustra says all of this is a complete misunderstanding. Any walls that are made to protect us from something imprisons us automatically. That wisdom is the condition of reality and is open, doesn't need protecting by us or anybody. It is not there because it is formed by our protective walls. Promulgating a lot of laws and codes to protect the good so it's not impinged on by the bad is automatically being deceived by the deceiver. There's no chance to be real. And so whatever happens is a struggle between factions of deception. All of them, the entire array, are factions of deception. It doesn't matter what position they hold. They're in a mode where all the positions that are held in that mode are deceiving. And there in actuality is no choice really between them. The choices of better or not so better between them are all on an intermediate level. We'll get more to Wittgenstein next week, but one of the qualities that came out of this for Ogden and Richards is that they realized that the ordinary languages of the world that people spoke had been misfounded. They had been founded on an intellectual assumption, on an authoritative, abstracted intellectual assumption, and that there no longer was an ordinary, fundamental, basic language in people's experience in the world that would give them the sentience upon which real intelligence could form itself out of. And so Richards especially put together the Pocketbook of Basic English. And when you look at the Pocketbook of Basic English, what do you find? It's full of pictures. It's full of the original way in which written language is I, you, he, she, it, they. In other words, they recreated, when did this come out? First printing, July 1945, about the time of the first atomic bomb. All of this, friends, is concomitant because it's all part of the same resonances of a scale, which if one can see architecturally, fit into a harmonic. And once you can see it, whatever you look at, you can see where it is in the harmonic. You can see if its resonances do come into a harmonic or if they are disjunctive and never will. Almost all of the teachers on the planet are chaotic and do not know it themselves. Almost all of them. More than 99%. It is on a scale of ignorance that is colossal. But we have seen in wisdom traditions, we have seen this many times in the last 4,000, 5,000 years. It's just that at this time, it is particularly crucial because the way to go about healing this, the way to go about correcting this, takes time. It takes a while. You can't do it in a weekend. You can't do it in any number of weekends. Why? Because reality has its spiraling continuity, and one has to have a reacclimatization back to that continuity for anything to begin to have its actuality, to have its truthfulness, its reality. There's no way that correlations that are not in a continuity have any way to sustain themselves. They all grind themselves up into atomic, subatomic particles of disputable meaning, and that's it. When Socrates first learned from Diotima of how to be real, he broached to her the very same thing that Phaedrus later will broach to Socrates. In the Symposium, which is the prelude to the Phaedrus, Socrates says, "And now I shall let you alone." He's speaking to somebody he's been arguing with, saying, "Now I'll let you alone, and proceed with the discourse upon love, which I heard one day from a Mantinean woman named Diotima. In this subject she was skilled, and in many others too, for once, by bidding the Athenians to offer sacrifices 10 years before the plague, she procured them so much delay in the advent of the sickness." In other words, the Black Plague descended upon Athens just about the time they were building the Parthenon. It often happens that the worst and the best happens exactly at the same time. So that one has to have not only a sense of proportion to endure, but one has to have the in-depth reality to proceed and continue with the reality and not freeze or fight or flight. All three of those options lose. All three. There's no choice between them whatsoever. You can't get away from the situation. You can't just freeze and get fundamental and stay and think you're protected from the situation, and you cannot fight it. So that if all of those three options end in dead ends, then what is there? Instead of an option, there's the reality of working with it in a transform to bring extra vision into play, to bring consciousness into play, so that the situation changes in two ways at the same time. They're always paired. One is that a future opens up that would not have been there before because it is now possible. And second, at the very same time, the past conditions that made the impasse also transform and modify so that the situation is no longer just in that form which is intractable. No longer just tragic, no longer just intractable at all. But that the past is as modifiable as the future is possible, both at the same time. It happened graphically in 1895, right at the time X-rays were discovered. One of the most seminal books of all time was written by H.G. Wells called The Time Machine. And in this time machine, his protagonist can go into the past and into the future. And when he goes into the future, there's a little bit of an accident, and he doesn't go just a little bit into the future, because as he goes a little bit into the future, every time he stops the time machine, there are wars that are more and more terrible. And in the novel, he gets so disgusted that every 20 years or so, it seems that human wars become more devastating and more people die, and finally he realizes that the next war will be the end of all life. So his protagonist slams on the dial, and he shoots 800,000 years into the future. And comes to rest when humanity is completely, surprisingly very nice, very naive. They're like beautiful, gorgeous, stylish young adults, and they're called the Eloi. They all have this nice complexion and nice hair, and they have food set out for them, and a beautiful, nice place, and gardens to play in, but they're all very much like children. But along with the Eloi are the Morlocks, who live under the ground. And the Morlocks are with the old machinery. And they farm the Eloi because they eat them. And they like to have nice meals. And so they raise very nice, naive, pretty people so that they can have very nice meals. H.G. Wells. This whole quality of pairedness, where the opposites are linked together, in logic, they are linked together in such a way that opposites, all of the options of opposites, lead eventually to dead ends. They lead to stagnant. So that a mind that would be purely optional in any way in terms of logic alone would end up dead. Would end up as a mechanical robot that would no longer be able to do anything, because it would reach a limbo where everything is 50-50 and nothing is choosable. This is one of the deepest things about the mind. The knack is not to get caught in a losing strategy. The logical method is a tool that's very useful to be applied. It is not a way to subsume oneself into that methodology at all. Socrates says that Diotima taught him for the very first time, I had This is from the Symposium. Well, I also had my first lesson from her in love matters. So now I will try and follow up the points on which we've been talking about. He says, finally, that in talking with Diotima, he said, well, how do you mean, Diotima? She was speaking that love is like a very great spirit and of beautiful things. She refuted me with the arguments I have brought against our young friend, showing that by my account that the God of love was neither beautiful nor good. How do you mean, Diotima? Said I. Is love then ugly and bad? Peace, for shame, she replied. Or do you imagine that whatever is not beautiful must needs be ugly? Well, to be sure I do. And what is not skilled, ignorant? Have you not observed that there is something halfway between skill and ignorance? And she goes on from there. One of the things that she's introducing is that in the logic of opposites of true and false, there are actually a set of 4 graphables. One is that here is true and false. And on the other side is the reverse. And on another way, there's an obverse. But diagonally down is a 4th thing. It's called the contrapositive. The contrapositive of A is B is not B is not A. It is not just the reverse of it, but involves a kind of a mere reversal of the whole thing, and it's negative. All of these options together were ways that had to be considered by the logical mind if it's going to have its symbolic structure in order. And the people who taught on this basis that one could be very sophisticated and use a language that could wend its way through this, they were called sophists. They were like the teachers everywhere on the planet now, holding weekends and conferences and the whole thing. Sophists. Beautiful people, grand expectations, very good language, well-dressed, lots of music, fantastic. In deception more than the people that they're trying to teach. Whereas the transform was not a sophist, but someone who loved wisdom, a philosophist, a philosopher. That the philosopher was the person of more dimensions than the problematic situation that was there. That 4-dimensional situation that is there completely changes once a new dimension is brought into play. And if you bring several new dimensions into play, each time you get a completely different way in which not only does this read out, but the way in which it manifests itself in the first place. And one of the deepest transforms was not just by vision and not just by art, but by history. That by the time you get to historical consciousness, there are as many transforming dimensions as there are dimensions of space already. Not just a 5th dimension, quintessentially, of consciousness, or a 6th dimension of the spiritual person, but you get the hyper-visionary consciousness of history, which is not a record of the past, but is a whole array of all possible interpretations based on a criticality of form inherited from the differential forms of art. And out of this criticality of the artistic form, historical consciousness engenders a further dimension, a further quality, which is capable now of something that is a higher order than a critique, and that is an analytic. And on that basis, the forms that come out are, the ancient word was science. They're scientific. They are scientific because one can bring into play not just a thesis of something and its antithesis, but one can bring a higher thesis into play called a hypothesis, a hypothesis. And instead of just being limited by the range of experience, one now can bring experiment in as transforms of possible experience. And so an analytic now proceeds to do something that is extraordinary. But it must have as its substrate traction an understanding of the dynamic of historical consciousness. Without knowing the history, your analytic will not have its emergence out of the very process that nourishes it. And so it's very important for somebody who's doing science to have their analytic tuned not to the symbolic mind, but to be tuned to the way in which historical experience is generated. And how is it generated? It is generated from persons. And so the art of person making is essential to the doing of good science. If there is not the differential art form of the person generating a historical consciousness that's really history and not just some kind of abstract idea of chronology, there's no way to understand that interpretation, hermeneia in Greek, is always opened, but not open to chaos, but open to refinement. That one can get very close quite quickly with the right approaches, with the right angles of vision. One can come very, very close to understanding pretty much how it is. And that with further historical consciousness, one can come even closer. And as one brings experiment into play, say you want to understand the history of the United States in 2004. How did all this happen so that it happens this way? One can bring in many different angles of vision, many different persons, and understand that the complexity of the historical consciousness can indeed be understood very, very closely. You can do a sociological angle, you can do a psychological angle, all of these kinds of things, but for a historical interpretation, one needs to know essentially who the people were. Not the actors on the stage, but those persons who are creating creatively the transforms of the script, so that what you're getting constantly is not just a playbill that's predetermined, but it's constantly shifting as it's being played out, and very often what is being given is not even understandable to those who are supposedly acting it and in control. Why? Because without the ability to have someone who is like an artistic director who constantly hones that differential form by a critique, asking the right questions, pointing out the right possibilities, and like a Socrates. A Socrates is constantly delivering the artistic critique of the conversation that's going on, so that it doesn't remain conversational, colloquial, but becomes a dialogue that generates its own structure, not on the basis of an abstract logic, but on the basis of a creative participation that brings into play more and more the artistic shaping of the talking with each other, so that it comes really into a symbolic form that is real. It comes out of actual experience. More next week.